The biting wind howled through the mountain pass like a wounded animal, carrying with it the desperate cries of Catherine Lowry as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, her arms cradling the still bundle pressed against her chest. The harsh winter of 1873 had descended upon Colorado territory with merciless fury, turning the once promising journey west into a nightmare that would haunt her forever. "Please," she whispered, her chapped lips cracking as she pressed them to her baby's forehead. "Please, my sweet child." But the tiny face remained motionless, blue-tinged and peaceful in eternal sleep. Little Emma had taken her last breath sometime during the night, the mountain cold proving too fierce for her small body. Catherine collapsed to her knees, the snow soaking through her threadbare dress. Her husband James had succumbed to fever 3 weeks prior, leaving her to continue the journey to her sister's home in Silverton alone with their infant daughter. Now, with Emma gone too, Catherine was truly alone in the vast, uncaring wilderness. She didn't know how long she knelt there, the tears freezing on her cheeks before the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her grief. She looked up, barely able to focus on the tall figure dismounting from a chestnut stallion. "Madam," the voice was deep, concerned. "You all right out here?" Catherine stared up at the stranger, a man with a weathered face partly hidden beneath the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. She clutched Emma's body tighter. "My baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She's gone. I lost my baby in the winter cold." The cowboy crouched beside her, his keen gray eyes taking in the situation with a single glance. Without a word, he gently placed his heavy coat around her shoulders, then removed his hat and placed it over his heart as he looked at the small bundle in her arms. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam," he said softly. "No one should face such sorrow alone." His kindness broke through the numbness that had settled over Catherine, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted. "My husband died on the trail. We were heading to Silverton, to my sister's, but I don't know if I can." Her voice faltered. The cowboy nodded slowly, replacing his hat. "Name's Kyle Harrington," he said. "My ranch is a half-day's ride from here. You need a proper place to lay your child to rest and recover your strength." He stood, offering his hand. "Then I'll keep you warm till spring, madam. Nobody should be alone with grief like this." Catherine looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and strong. She had no reason to trust this stranger, yet something in his steady gaze spoke of honor and decency. "Catherine," she replied, taking his hand with her free one. "Catherine Lowry." Kyle helped her to her feet, then respectfully asked if he could take the child while she mounted his horse. With trembling arms, Catherine surrendered Emma's body, watching as Kyle cradled her with surprising tenderness. He carefully handed the bundle back once Catherine was seated in the saddle, then took the reins and began leading the horse through the snow. "My place isn't much," Kyle said after they had walked in silence for nearly an hour. "But it's solid with a good hearth. We'll get you warm, get some food in you." "Why are you helping me?" Catherine asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Kyle was quiet for a moment. "My ma always said you don't question helping someone in need. It's just what's right." They reached Kyle's ranch as the winter sun began its early descent. It was modest, but well-maintained, a sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from the stone chimney, a barn and corrals for livestock. Mountains rose up behind it, and a creek, partially frozen, ran along one side. A young man with a similar look to Kyle emerged from the barn, his eyes widening at the sight of Catherine. "Caleb," Kyle called. "This is Mrs. Lowry. She's in need of our help." Caleb nodded, hurrying forward to assist. "I'll stable Rusty," he said, taking the reins from his brother. Kyle helped Catherine down, noticing how she swayed from exhaustion. Without asking permission, he swept her into his arms, still holding Emma's body, and carried them both into the cabin. Inside was simple but comfortable, a main room with a fireplace, a wooden table with chairs, and a few pieces of sturdy furniture. A hallway led to what Catherine presumed were bedrooms. Kyle set her down gently on a chair by the fire, which was burning low. He immediately added more wood, stoking it until flames leaped and cast a warm glow throughout the room. "Mrs. Lowry, I know this is difficult," he said, kneeling before her, "but we should prepare your child for burial. The ground's too frozen now for a proper grave, but we can build a small cairn until spring." Catherine nodded, unable to speak. She hadn't considered what would happen to Emma's body. The thought of laying her in the cold ground was unbearable. "I'll help," said a female voice from the doorway. Catherine turned to see a slender woman with Kyle's gray eyes and brown hair pulled back in a simple bun. "This is my sister, Sarah," Kyle explained. "Sarah, this is Mrs. Lowry. She's lost her child and husband." Sarah's face softened with compassion. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said, approaching Catherine. "May I help prepare your little one? I've some clean linens we could use." Catherine hesitated, then slowly nodded. She couldn't bear to let go of Emma, but she knew it was necessary. With trembling hands, she passed her daughter to Sarah, who cradled the small body with reverence. "What was her name?" Sarah asked softly. "Emma," Catherine whispered. "Emma Rose Lowry." "A beautiful name for a beautiful soul," Sarah replied. "I'll take good care of her, I promise." As Sarah carried Emma to another room, Kyle pulled up a chair beside Catherine. "When did you last eat, Mrs. Lowry?" Catherine tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think. Some hardtack." Kyle frowned and stood, moving to the kitchen area. "I'll make you something warm. You need your strength." Catherine watched as he moved efficiently around the kitchen, stoking the cookstove and setting a pot over the heat. There was something comforting in his capable movements, a steadiness that made her feel less adrift in her sea of grief. Caleb entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Storm's picking up again," he reported. "Looks like we're in for a long night." Kyle nodded. "Mrs. Lowry will stay in the spare room. Sarah can lend her some clothes." Catherine wanted to protest, to insist she couldn't impose, but exhaustion and grief had stripped her of energy. Instead, she stared into the fire, wondering how life could continue after such devastating loss. Kyle brought her a bowl of stew, rich with chunks of venison and vegetables. "Eat," he said gently. "Then rest. Everything else can wait until tomorrow." Catherine managed a few spoonfuls before Sarah returned. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her voice was steady. "I've prepared the little one," she said. "She's wrapped in my finest quilt. We can have a service tomorrow when you've had some rest." "Thank you," Catherine said, the words inadequate for the kindness being shown to her by these strangers. Later, after Sarah had helped her bathe and change into a borrowed nightgown, Catherine lay in a small but comfortable bedroom, staring at the ceiling. The house creaked and settled around her, the wind howling outside a painful reminder of the wilderness that had taken her family. Sleep eluded her as memories of James and Emma flooded her mind. James's laughter as he spoke of the life they would build in Colorado. Emma's tiny fingers curled around her own. The future they had planned together, now shattered beyond repair. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Lowry," Kyle's voice was low. "I brought you some tea, helps with sleep." Catherine sat up, pulling the quilt around her shoulders. "Come in." Kyle entered, a steaming cup in his hand. In the soft lamplight, she noticed details she had missed before: the small scar near his left eye, the flecks of silver in his dark brown hair despite him not appearing much older than 30. "Thank you," she said, accepting the cup. "For everything." Kyle nodded, lingering awkwardly by the doorway. "I'm sorry about your family," he said finally. "I know words don't help much, but I mean it all the same." Catherine took a sip of the tea, warm and slightly bitter with herbs. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I was so far from the main trail." "I was tracking a mountain lion that's been taking my calves," Kyle explained. "Trail led up into the pass. Probably a blessing in disguise, though I doubt it feels that way to you now." "No," Catherine agreed. "Nothing feels like a blessing at the moment." Kyle hesitated, then said, "The offer stands, Mrs. Lowry. You're welcome here until spring, until you can safely travel to Silverton, or longer if needed. We're simple folk, but we look after our own." "I'm not your own," Catherine pointed out. "You are now," Kyle replied simply. He wished her good night and closed the door softly behind him. Catherine finished her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her body. She lay back down, expecting the familiar barrier of grief to keep sleep at bay. But whether from exhaustion, the tea, or the strange comfort of knowing she wasn't alone, she drifted into a deep slumber, the first real rest she'd had in weeks. The following days passed in a haze of grief and small kindnesses. The morning after her arrival, Kyle and Caleb built a small stone cairn for Emma on a rise overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains. Catherine stood numbly as Kyle spoke a few words, his deep voice carrying on the winter air. Sarah had found a small wooden cross which they placed atop the stones. "In the spring," Kyle promised, "when the ground thaws, we'll give her a proper burial. I know a spot with wildflowers. It would be pretty for a little one." Catherine had nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She visited the cairn daily, sometimes just standing in silence, sometimes speaking softly to Emma, telling her about the kind people who had taken them in. As January yielded to February, Catherine slowly began to participate in the daily life of the ranch. She helped Sarah with cooking and mending, grateful for tasks that occupied her hands and mind. She learned that Kyle had inherited the ranch from their father 5 years earlier, that Sarah was a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, and that young Caleb, just 20, was learning the ranching business from his older brother. The Harrington siblings treated Catherine with respect and space to grieve, never pushing her to speak of her loss but always willing to listen when she did. Kyle, in particular, seemed to sense when she needed company and when she needed solitude. One evening in late February, Catherine was helping Sarah prepare dinner when Kyle and Caleb burst through the door, their faces grim. "What's happened?" Sarah asked, setting down the knife she had been using to chop vegetables. "Mountain lion," Kyle said tersely. "Took down one of the pregnant heifers. We tracked it but lost the trail when the snow started falling again. It's getting bolder," Caleb added. "Came right up to the north pasture in broad daylight." Catherine noticed the long scratch down Kyle's forearm. "You're hurt," she said, moving to examine the wound. "It's nothing," Kyle insisted, but he didn't pull away as Catherine led him to a chair by the fire. "Sarah, could you bring me some clean water and bandages?" Catherine asked, falling naturally into the role of caretaker. She had tended countless injuries during the journey west with James. Kyle watched as she cleaned the scratch, which was deeper than he had admitted. "You've done this before," he observed. "My father was a doctor in Pennsylvania," Catherine explained, applying a salve Sarah had brought. "I assisted him sometimes, and on the trail west, there were always injuries to tend." "How long were you traveling?" Kyle asked. Catherine wrapped a clean bandage around his arm. "Nearly 4 months. We left in late August, thinking we would reach Silverton before the worst of winter." She tied off the bandage, her fingers lingering on his warm skin. "James caught fever near Pueblo. We delayed too long there, hoping he would recover." It was the most she had spoken of her journey since arriving. Kyle seemed to recognize this, keeping his questions gentle. "What awaits you in Silverton, my sister Margaret? She married a mine manager there 2 years ago." Catherine finished with the bandage and moved away, suddenly aware of the intimacy of their position. "She doesn't know about James or Emma, or that I'm even on my way. When spring comes, I'll take you to Silverton myself," Kyle promised. "Ensure you arrive safely." The thought of leaving brought an unexpected pang to Catherine's heart. Despite her grief, or perhaps because of it, she had found comfort in the simple routines of the ranch, in the quiet strength of the Harrington family. March brought slightly milder weather, though snow still blanketed the high country. The days grew longer, allowing for more work around the ranch. Catherine found herself looking forward to the mornings, to the simple breakfast shared around the table, to Kyle's deep voice as he discussed the day's tasks with Caleb. On a particularly clear day, Kyle asked Catherine if she would like to ride out to check on some of the cattle. "You've been cooped up for weeks," he said. "Might do you good to get some fresh air." Catherine hesitated. She hadn't ridden since arriving at the ranch, hadn't ventured far from the cabin except to visit Emma's cairn, but something in Kyle's steady gaze made her nod in agreement. He saddled a gentle mare for her, helping her mount with strong hands at her waist. They rode in comfortable silence, the horses' hooves crunching through the crusty snow. Kyle led them along the creek, now flowing freely in patches where the ice had melted, then up into the foothills where early spring grass was beginning to emerge in protected sunny spots. "It's beautiful here," Catherine said as they paused on a ridge overlooking the valley. "Peaceful." Kyle nodded. "That's why my father chose this spot. Said he wanted a place where a man could hear himself think." He glanced at her. "I know it's not much compared to Pennsylvania, but it's home." "I think it's wonderful," Catherine replied honestly. "James and I dreamed of having our own land someday, though we weren't sure if we'd settle in Colorado or continue on to California." "What was he like?" Kyle asked. "Your husband." Catherine smiled at the memory. "Kind, ambitious, always planning for the future." She looked down at her hands, gripping the reins. "He was a good man. I wish you could have met him." "As do I," Kyle said. "Any man who won your heart must have been exceptional." The simple compliment warmed Catherine's cheeks. Kyle had been unfailingly considerate since her arrival, but this was the first hint that he might see her as more than a widow in need of assistance. They rode back to the ranch as the sun began to set, the western sky ablaze with orange and pink. At the barn, Kyle helped Catherine dismount, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for today," Catherine said. "I hadn't realized how much I needed to see beyond the cabin walls." "Anytime," Kyle replied. "Perhaps tomorrow we could ride to the East Meadow. The first flowers might be appearing." Catherine found herself looking forward to it more than she would have thought possible. That night, as she lay in bed, she realized that for the first time since losing Emma, she had gone an entire day without crying. The guilt that followed was immediate and crushing. How could she find enjoyment in anything when her baby and husband were gone? She slipped out of bed and pulled on her boots and coat, needing to visit Emma's cairn. The night was cold but clear, the moon casting enough light to guide her path. As she approached the small mound of stones, she saw a figure already standing there. Kyle turned at the sound of her footsteps. "Mrs. Lowry," he said, surprised. "I didn't expect anyone else to be up at this hour." "Nor did I," Catherine replied, moving to stand beside him. "What brings you here?" Kyle looked embarrassed. "I come sometimes to check that nothing's disturbed the stones and to talk to her a bit." Catherine's heart constricted. "You talked to Emma," Kyle nodded, his face half hidden in shadow. "I tell her about the ranch, about the changes in the weather. I promise her we're looking after you." He cleared his throat. "Probably sounds foolish." No, Catherine said, tears welling in her eyes. It sounds kind. Thank you for remembering her. I didn't know her, Kyle said softly, but I know she was loved. That counts for something in this world. Catherine wiped away her tears. I felt guilty today, she admitted, for enjoying our ride, for feeling anything other than grief. Your husband and daughter wouldn't want you to stop living, Kyle said. I didn't know them, but I'm certain of that much. How can you be so sure? Because they loved you, Kyle said simply. Love doesn't want the other person to suffer endlessly. They stood in silence for a while, the night air cold but somehow less bitter than it had been in weeks past. Finally, Kyle offered Catherine his arm. Let me walk you back to the cabin. Dawn comes early, and Sarah will have my hide if you catch cold on my account. Catherine smiled slightly and took his arm. As they walked back, she felt a subtle shift in her grief, not a lessening. Exactly, but perhaps the first tentative step toward acceptance. The following weeks brought more signs of approaching spring. The creek ran fully now, the ice retreating to the shadiest banks. Green shoots appeared in protected areas, and birds returned to the trees surrounding the ranch. Catherine continued to ride out with Kyle daily, learning the boundaries of his property and the rhythms of ranch life. She also spent time with Sarah, whose quiet strength reminded Catherine of her own mother. Sarah taught her to make bread in the ranch's wood stove, to card wool from their small flock of sheep, and to identify the edible plants that would soon emerge from the thawing ground. "You're good for my brother," Sarah commented one afternoon as they worked side by side, mending shirts. "I haven't seen him this at ease in years." Catherine looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" Sarah's needle flashed in the sunlight streaming through the window. "Kyle takes responsibility seriously, too seriously sometimes. Since Pa died, he's carried the weight of this ranch, of providing for Caleb and me. He rarely takes time for himself." She tied off a thread. "But with you, he makes time for those rides, for conversations that aren't just about cattle and fences." "He's been kind to me," Catherine said carefully. "I'm grateful." Sarah gave her a knowing look. "It's more than kindness, Catherine. Surely you've noticed." Catherine bent her head over her mending, unable to deny that she had indeed noticed the way Kyle's gaze followed her, the way his hand sometimes lingered when helping her mount or dismount, the way he sought her opinion on matters around the ranch as if her thoughts truly mattered to him. And if she were honest with herself, she would admit that she looked forward to their time together, that she found his steady presence comforting, that she sometimes caught herself watching him as he worked the sure movements of his hands, the rare but transformative smile that lightened his serious face. But such thoughts brought waves of guilt. James had been dead less than 3 months. How could she even consider feelings for another man? "It's not disloyal to find comfort in someone new," Sarah said softly, seeming to read Catherine's thoughts. "Life continues, even after loss." "I learned that after my William died." Catherine set down her sewing. "How long were you married?" 6 years, Sarah replied. "No children, though we tried. He died 4 years ago." "And you never thought to remarry?" Sarah shrugged. "There aren't many eligible men in these parts." "And I have the ranch, Kyle and Caleb," she smiled. "It's enough." Catherine wondered if it truly was enough, or if Sarah had simply convinced herself it must be. The thought of spending years alone with only memories for company filled Catherine with a desolation that rivaled her grief. That evening, Kyle announced that he needed to ride to the nearby town of Pahrump for supplies. "I'll be gone 2 days," he told them over dinner. "Caleb, you'll need to check the north pasture fence. That last snow damaged it." "I could go with you," Catherine offered impulsively. "To Pahrump?" "I need to send a letter to my sister in Silverton to let her know I'm coming." Kyle looked surprised but pleased. "It's a rough trail this time of year." "I'm stronger than I look," Catherine replied, "and I've been cooped up all winter." Kyle glanced at Sarah, who nodded her approval. "Very well," he agreed. "We'll leave at first light." The journey to Pahrump took most of the day, the trail still muddy and treacherous in places from melting snow. Catherine rode well, keeping pace with Kyle even through difficult stretches. They talked easily about the ranch, about Catherine's life in Pennsylvania, about Kyle's hopes for expanding his herd come summer. Pahrump was smaller than Catherine had expected, a single main street with a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a handful of other businesses. Kyle explained that it served as a supply point for the scattered ranches and mining operations in the area. "Not much to look at," he admitted, "but they stock what we need, and the people are decent enough." They took rooms at the hotel, a simple two-story building with clean but sparse accommodations. After stabling their horses, Kyle escorted Catherine to the general store, where she purchased paper and ink to write to Margaret. The storekeeper, a round man with spectacles perched on his nose, peered curiously at Catherine. "New face in these parts," he observed. "You visiting the Harrington spread?" "Mrs. Lowry is staying with us for a time," Kyle explained, his tone discouraging further inquiry. The storekeeper nodded, but Catherine could see the speculation in his eyes. A woman staying at a bachelor's ranch, even with a sister present, was bound to raise eyebrows. Back at the hotel, Catherine wrote her letter, explaining James's death and her delayed journey. She mentioned Emma only briefly, finding it still too painful to describe in detail. She explained that she had been taken in by kind strangers and would arrive in Silverton once the mountain passes cleared. Kyle took the letter to be sent, then suggested they dine at the hotel's small restaurant. The meal was simple but well prepared, a welcome change from their own cooking. They lingered over coffee, Kyle telling stories about growing up on the ranch, about his father's dreams for the property. "He would have liked you," Kyle said. "Pa appreciated people who faced hardship with courage." "I don't feel particularly courageous," Catherine admitted. "Most days, I'm just trying to keep breathing." "That's courage in itself," Kyle replied, continuing on when it would be easier to give up. His words touched something deep within Catherine, a recognition that her daily struggle was not weakness but a kind of strength. She reached across the table and squeezed his hand impulsively. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." Kyle looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. His expression held a warmth that made Catherine's heart quicken. "I should be thanking you," he said. "You've brought something back to the ranch that was missing, a sense of—" he searched for the word, "purpose, I suppose." They returned to their rooms soon after, the moment between them lingering in Catherine's mind as she prepared for bed. For the first time since James's death, she found herself thinking of the future not with dread, but with cautious curiosity. The next morning, after Kyle had completed his business in town, they began the journey back to the ranch. The day was unusually warm for March, the snow melting rapidly in the midday sun. As they approached a narrow part of the trail that hugged the mountainside, Kyle held up his hand for Catherine to stop. "The trail looks unstable," he said, dismounting to examine the muddy ground. "Recent slide. We should be careful." He was leading his horse forward when the ground beneath him suddenly gave way. Catherine watched in horror as Kyle and his horse tumbled down the steep embankment amid a shower of rocks and mud. "Kyle!" she screamed, scrambling off her horse and rushing to the edge. Below, about 20 feet down, Kyle lay motionless, partially pinned beneath his struggling horse. Without hesitation, Catherine began making her way down the slope, slipping and sliding in the mud but determined to reach him. The horse had managed to free itself and was limping away, leaving Kyle still and vulnerable. When she reached him, Catherine's medical training took over. She carefully checked for broken bones, relieved to find that his legs appeared uninjured. But a gash on his forehead was bleeding profusely and his right arm was bent at an unnatural angle. "Kyle," she said, pressing a handkerchief to the wound. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered, then opened. "Catherine," he muttered, trying to sit up. "Don't move," she ordered. "You've fallen. Your arm is broken and you may have other injuries." Kyle grimaced in pain but remained conscious. "The horses. Mine is still up on the trail. Yours got free and is nearby." Catherine looked up at the steep slope. "We need to get you back to the trail, but I don't know if I can help you climb." Kyle assessed their situation with remarkable clarity despite his injury. "There's a wider path about 50 yards ahead. Less steep. If you can help me walk there, we might be able to make it up." Catherine nodded, tearing a strip from her petticoat to create a makeshift sling for his injured arm. Then she helped him to his feet, supporting him as he swayed from dizziness. The journey to the alternate path was slow and painful, Kyle leaning heavily on Catherine, his face pale with shock and pain. By the time they reached the gentler slope, both were exhausted. "Rest a moment," Catherine insisted, helping Kyle sit on a boulder. "We need to get back before dark," Kyle argued, but he didn't resist when Catherine offered him water from her canteen. "Your horse followed us," Catherine said, pointing to where the chestnut stallion stood watching them warily, favoring its left front leg. "I'll try to catch him. We can't both ride mine." It took patience and gentle coaxing, but eventually Catherine managed to approach Kyle's horse and secure its reins. The animal was injured but could still walk, which was fortunate. Getting Kyle back up to the trail was an arduous process, with Catherine supporting as much of his weight as she could. By the time they reached the top, both were covered in mud and breathing hard. "You're stronger than you look," Kyle said with a strained attempt at humor. Catherine helped him mount her horse, deciding it was safer than his injured stallion. "I told you so," she replied, trying to match his light tone despite her fear. She would lead both horses back to the ranch, walking beside Kyle to ensure he didn't fall. The journey back took twice as long as their outward trip, the sun setting as they finally approached the ranch. Sarah and Caleb rushed out when they saw them, alarmed by Kyle's condition and the late hour. "What happened?" Sarah demanded as Caleb helped his brother from the saddle. "Landslide," Catherine explained, exhaustion washing over her now that they were safe. "His arm is broken and he has a head wound." "Get him inside," Sarah instructed Caleb. "Catherine, I'll need your help setting the bone." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Catherine worked alongside Sarah to clean Kyle's wounds, set and splint his broken arm, and make him as comfortable as possible in his bed. He bore the pain stoically, only once crying out when they manipulated the broken bone back into place. "You should rest," Sarah told Catherine after they had finished. "You look ready to collapse." But Catherine shook her head. "I'll sit with him for a while, make sure the fever doesn't start." Sarah didn't argue, recognizing the determination in Catherine's eyes. She simply squeezed her shoulder and left, closing the door softly behind her. Catherine pulled a chair close to Kyle's bedside and sat, watching the rise and fall of his chest. His face was peaceful in sleep, the lines of pain smoothed away. She reached out to brush a lock of hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering on his warm skin. The events of the day had clarified something within her, the realization that her feelings for Kyle had grown beyond gratitude or friendship. The terror she had felt seeing him fall, the fierce determination to get him home safely, spoke of deeper emotions than she had been willing to acknowledge. Kyle stirred, his eyes opening slowly. "Catherine," he murmured. "I'm here," she assured him, taking his uninjured hand. "How do you feel?" "Like I fell down a mountain," he replied with a weak smile. "Thank you for getting me home." "You would have done the same for me," Catherine said. Kyle's fingers tightened around hers. "You could have been killed coming down that slope." "So could you," she countered. "Did you expect me to leave you there?" "No," he admitted. "You're too stubborn for that," Catherine laughed softly. "Rest now. We can argue about my stubbornness when you're feeling better." Kyle's eyes were already closing again. The laudanum Sarah had given him for pain taking effect. But he didn't release Catherine's hand, and she didn't pull away, sitting beside him as night deepened outside the window. The following days were focused on Kyle's recovery. His injuries, while painful, were not life-threatening, but he chafed at the enforced inactivity. Catherine found herself spending most of her time keeping him company, reading to him from one of the few books in the house, playing checkers, or simply talking. "You don't have to entertain me," Kyle protested one afternoon as Catherine prepared to read from a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans. "I know," she replied, settling into the chair beside his bed. "But I enjoy your company." Kyle studied her face. "Even when I'm a terrible patient." "Especially then," Catherine teased. "It makes me feel useful." "You've always been useful," Kyle said more seriously. "But you're more than that, Catherine. You must know that." Catherine felt her cheeks warm under his direct gaze. "What am I, then?" "Essential," Kyle said simply. "To this place, to me." The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Catherine closed the book, her hands trembling slightly. "Kyle, you don't need to say anything," he interrupted. "I know it's too soon. I know you're still mourning your husband and child. I just wanted you to know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Catherine's heart ached with conflicting emotions: grief for what she had lost, fear of opening herself to potential pain again, and a growing affection for the man before her. "Thank you for understanding," she said softly. "For not pushing." Kyle nodded, his expression gentle. "We have time, Catherine. Spring is just beginning." April brought warmer weather and new growth to the ranch. The snow retreated to the highest peaks, and wildflowers began to carpet the meadows. Kyle's arm healed slowly but steadily, allowing him to resume some of his duties around the property. One morning, he found Catherine at Emma's cairn, where she had placed a small bouquet of early blossoms. "The ground is thawed enough now," he said quietly. "If you'd like to have a proper burial for Emma." Catherine nodded, tears in her eyes. "I think it's time." The next day, Kyle led Catherine, Sarah, and Caleb to a beautiful spot on a gentle slope overlooking the ranch. Wildflowers dotted the green grass, and a solitary pine provided dappled shade. "I thought here," Kyle said. "You can see the cabin, the mountains, and the sunrise." "It's perfect," Catherine whispered. Caleb had already dug a small grave lined with soft pine boughs. They carefully transferred Emma's tiny body, still wrapped in Sarah's quilt, from the cairn to her final resting place. Kyle had carved a proper marker from wood, with Emma's name and dates etched carefully into the surface. As they stood around the grave, Kyle spoke a few words, his deep voice steady and comforting. Then Catherine sang a lullaby, her voice breaking on the final notes. They each placed a wildflower on the small mound before walking back to the cabin in silence, Kyle's good arm around Catherine's shoulders. That evening, sitting on the porch as the sun set, Catherine felt a subtle shift within her grief, not an ending, but a transformation. Emma would always be a part of her, as would James, but perhaps there was room in her heart for new beginnings as well. "What are you thinking?" Kyle asked, joining her on the porch step. "About Emma," Catherine replied. "About how she'll always be with me no matter where I go," Kyle nodded. "That's as it should be." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and stars appeared one by one. Finally, Catherine spoke the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Kyle, What happens when the pass is clear, when it's time for me to go to Silverton?" Kyle looked at her, his face half hidden in shadow. "That depends on you, Catherine. I meant what I said. You have a place here for as long as you want it. And if I want it forever—" The words slipped out before she could reconsider. Kyle's breath caught audibly. "Do you mean that?" Catherine turned to face him fully. "I didn't expect to find happiness again. After losing James and Emma, I thought that part of my life was over. But you and Sarah and Caleb, you've shown me that life continues, that love continues." She took a deep breath. "I've grown to care for you, Kyle. More than I thought possible." Kyle reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I've loved you since that day on the mountain pass," he admitted. "Even in your grief, your strength amazed me." He hesitated. "But I need to be sure. Is this what you truly want? Not out of gratitude or a need for security, but because your heart chooses it." "My heart chooses you," Catherine said with certainty. "The gratitude and security are just added blessings." Kyle smiled, a full, transformative smile that lit his entire face. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, a promise rather than a demand, and Catherine felt tears of happiness spring to her eyes. When they parted, Kyle kept her hand in his. "I'll still take you to Silverton," he said. "Your sister should know you're safe. And if you change your mind after seeing her—" "I won't," Catherine interrupted. "But yes, I would like to see Margaret, to introduce her to the man I intend to marry if he'll have me." Kyle's smile widened. "He'll have you, Catherine Lowry. For as long as you'll have him." The mountain passes cleared in late April, making travel to Silverton possible. Kyle insisted on making the journey despite his still healing arm, unwilling to let Catherine travel alone or to be parted from her. They left the ranch in Caleb and Sarah's capable hands, promising to return within 2 weeks. The journey to Silverton was arduous but beautiful, the landscape transformed by spring. Catherine found herself seeing the mountains through new eyes, not as the harsh wilderness that had taken her family, but as the majestic setting for her unexpected second chance at happiness. Margaret's joy at seeing her sister alive was tempered by grief for James and Emma. The sisters cried together, sharing memories and sorrow, but when Catherine introduced Kyle as her intended, Margaret embraced him without hesitation. "I can see how she looks at you," Margaret told him privately. "I haven't seen that light in her eyes since before she left Pennsylvania." They stayed in Silverton for a week, giving Catherine time to reconnect with her sister and Margaret time to know Kyle. By the time they prepared to leave, Margaret had given her blessing and promised to visit the ranch in the summer. "Are you sure you won't stay here?" Margaret asked as they said their goodbyes. "We have room and Patrick could find work for Kyle at the mine." Catherine shook her head. "My home is with Kyle now, on the ranch." She hugged her sister tightly. "But we'll visit often, I promise." The journey back to the ranch felt different, no longer a retreat from grief but a journey toward the future. They rode side by side, making plans for the summer, for improvements to the ranch house, for a wedding in the autumn when the harvest was done. As they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Catherine reined in her horse, taking in the sight of the cabin nestled against the mountains, smoke rising from the chimney, the fields green with new growth. "Welcome home," Kyle said, drawing his horse alongside hers. Catherine smiled, reaching for his hand. "Home," she repeated, the word filling her with peace. "I like the sound of that." They were married in October when the aspen trees turned gold against the mountains and the first hint of winter crispness returned to the air. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by Margaret and Patrick from Silverton, neighbors from surrounding ranches, and a few townsfolk from Pahrump who had come to know and respect the Harringtons. Sarah had sewn Catherine a simple but elegant dress of ivory linen, and Caleb stood proudly as his brother's best man. The local minister performed the ceremony on the porch of the cabin, the same spot where Catherine and Kyle had shared their first kiss months earlier. "I never expected to find love again," Catherine said as part of her vows, her voice clear and steady. "You showed me that grief and joy can coexist, that opening my heart again wasn't a betrayal of what I'd lost, but an honoring of life's continuity." Kyle's vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. "I promise to keep you warm until spring," he said, smiling at the memory. "Now I promise to keep you warm for all the seasons of our lives." Their first winter as husband and wife was mild compared to the previous year, but Kyle still took his promise seriously, keeping the hearth well stocked and holding Catherine close during the long nights. They visited Emma's grave often, sometimes together, sometimes allowing each other private moments of remembrance. In the spring of 1875, exactly 1 year after Emma's proper burial, Catherine discovered she was expecting a child. The news brought both joy and happiness at the new life growing within her, fear that history might repeat itself. "This child will know about their sister," Catherine told Kyle as they sat by Emma's grave, now surrounded by wildflowers. "About James, too. They're part of our story. And this child will be loved twice as fiercely," Kyle promised, his hand protective over her still flat stomach. "By all of us." In November, Catherine gave birth to a healthy boy they named Daniel James Harrington. Sarah and Caleb doted on their nephew, and even Margaret made the difficult journey from Silverton to meet the newest member of the family. As Catherine watched Kyle holding their son, his face filled with wonder and love, she felt the full circle of her journey from devastating loss to unexpected joy, from the bitter cold of grief to the warmth of new beginnings. "What are you thinking?" Kyle asked, noticing her contemplative expression. Catherine smiled, moving to join her husband and son by the fire. "About promises kept," she said. "About warmth that lasts beyond spring." Kyle wrapped his free arm around her, drawing her close. "Always," he vowed, "for all the seasons to come." 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Emma Sarah Harrington, named for the sister she would never meet but whose memory lived on in the stories her parents told. And when little Emma asked about her name, Catherine would take her to the flower-covered grave on the hillside and tell her about the brave baby girl who had traveled so far but found her rest on their mountain. The ranch prospered under Kyle's management, expanding to include more cattle and better facilities. Catherine used her medical knowledge to care for their family and neighbors, eventually becoming known throughout the area for her healing skills. Sarah married a widower from a neighboring ranch, while Caleb eventually took over a portion of the Harrington land to start his own spread. As the years passed, Catherine's grief remained a part of her, but no longer the defining characteristic. She had learned that love was not finite, that opening her heart to Kyle and their children didn't diminish what she had felt for James and her first Emma. Rather, it honored their memory by embracing the fullness of life they would have wanted for her. On cold winter nights, when the wind howled around the sturdy cabin that had become her home, Catherine would often think back to that desperate day on the mountain pass. She had lost so much, had been certain her life was ending along with her child's. Instead, she had found a new beginning in the arms of a cowboy who had promised to keep her warm until spring, and had kept that promise through all the seasons of their life together.